Chapter 6. The Final Warning. Ethan held his breath in the basement darkness, pressing himself against the cold concrete wall as that impossible light swept closer. The thing that sounded like Lena had stopped laughing, but he could hear it moving, not walking, but something between a glide and a crawl that made his skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The footsteps retreated back up the stairs with that same inhuman rhythm, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Ethan heard the basement door close with a soft click. He waited another hour before moving, every muscle cramped from holding perfectly still. When he finally crept up the stairs and peered through the door, the house was empty again. Or at least, it appeared to be. But something had changed while he'd been hiding. The destruction was the same, the shattered mirrors and torn furniture unchanged. But now there were new additions scattered throughout the rooms. Photographs, dozens of them, placed with deliberate care on every available surface. Pictures of him sleeping. Not the ones from Lena's hidden camera, but new images taken from impossible angles. Shots that showed him in their bed from above, as if the photographer had been floating near the ceiling. Close-ups of his face in sleep, so detailed he could see the individual pores in his skin. And in each photograph, barely visible in the shadows at the edges of the frame, was that same tall, angular figure he'd seen before. The thing hadn't just been watching him through Lena's eyes. It had been documenting him, studying him, learning the rhythms of his vulnerability. Ethan gathered as many of the photographs as he could find and stuffed them into a garbage bag, but he knew there were more hidden throughout the house, tucked behind remaining books, taped to the undersides of drawers, slipped between the pages of magazines. A comprehensive surveillance archive that transformed his home into a museum of his own unconscious moments. He packed quickly, throwing essentials into a duffel bag while constantly checking over his shoulder. Every shadow could hide something watching. Every reflection in the broken mirrors could show him something that wasn't there. The house felt alive around him, malevolent and hungry, as if the entity's presence had infected the very structure. By the time he reached his car, the sun was setting, and the broken windows of his house were beginning to reflect the orange sky like dead eyes. He drove to a different motel this time, one on the opposite side of town, and paid cash for a room in the back where his car wouldn't be visible from the street. The room was identical to the last one, cheap, anonymous, safe, but he found himself checking the locks multiple times and positioning chairs to block both the door and the window. It was past midnight when his phone rang. The caller ID showed their home number, which was impossible. The landline had been disconnected months ago when they'd switched to cell phones exclusively. But the phone kept ringing, the familiar number glowing on the screen like an accusation. Ethan let it go to voicemail, then immediately wished he hadn't. The notification icon appeared and he found himself staring at it, knowing he shouldn't listen, but unable to stop himself. The message was 8 minutes long. For the first 3 minutes, it was just breathing. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Not quite human breathing, but close enough to make his skin crawl. Then Lena's voice, but distorted, as if it was being played through water. "You can't hide from me, Ethan. I know where you are. I can smell your fear through the phone line." A pause, filled with that same impossible breathing. "I'm in our bedroom now, standing right where you used to sleep. The bed still smells like you. Like sweat and dreams, and that cologne you think I don't notice." A sound like laughter, but wrong. "I've been thinking about all the nights I watched you here, all the times you were so peaceful, so trusting, so completely unaware of how close you came to never waking up." Another pause. When the voice returned, it was softer, more seductive. "I miss you, darling. I miss the weight of your attention, the warmth of your gaze. Do you know what it's like to exist only in the spaces between observation? To be real only when someone's looking away?" The breathing grew heavier. "But you taught me something wonderful when you left. You taught me that I don't need to wait for you to look away anymore." The sound of footsteps, moving through the house with purpose. "I can look away for you. I can blink your wife's eyes and step fully into the world. And once I'm here, once I'm completely real." A sound like fingers dragging across glass. "Well, then I can come find you properly." The footsteps stopped. "I'm coming for you tonight, Ethan. Not to your little motel room, that would be too easy. I'm coming to visit you in your dreams, where you can't run, can't hide, can't do anything, but watch while I show you what your wife's body can do when someone else is driving it. The message ended with the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a dial tone that seemed to echo long after the voicemail finished. Ethan deleted the message immediately, but he could still hear that distorted voice in his head, could still feel the malevolent pleasure in its tone. The thing wasn't just hunting him, it was savoring the process, drawing out his terror like a fine wine. He checked the locks again, pushed furniture against the door, and settled into the room's single chair with his back to the wall and a clear view of all possible entrances. He wasn't going to sleep tonight, maybe not ever again. But exhaustion was stronger than fear, and sometime after 3 a.m., his eyes began to close despite his best efforts to stay awake. He dreamed he was back in their bedroom, lying in his familiar spot with Lena beside him. She was sleeping peacefully, her hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, one hand resting on his chest. Everything was normal, perfect, exactly as it had been before the nightmare began. Then her eyes opened. They weren't Lena's eyes. They were completely black, like pools of oil that reflected nothing. She smiled with lips that were too wide, too full of teeth, and set up with that same inhuman fluidity he'd witnessed so many times. "Hello, darling," she said in a voice like breaking glass. "Did you miss me?" In the dream, Ethan couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but lie there as she straddled his chest, her weight pressing down on his ribcage until breathing became difficult. "I want to show you something," she whispered, her face inches from his. "Something your wife discovered before she went away." She raised her hands, and Ethan saw that her fingers ended in claws, not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between that was worse than either. The claws hovered over his throat, close enough that he could feel their sharp points against his skin. "Do you know what happens when you stop watching?" she asked conversationally, "when you finally, completely, utterly look away." The claws pressed deeper, drawing thin lines of blood. "You forget how to stop," she continued. "You forget where the game ends and the reality begins. You forget that there was ever a difference between love and hunger." Blood began to flow more freely now, warm and sticky against his neck. "She fought so hard to protect you," the thing said, and for a moment its voice carried an echo of genuine sadness. "Even at the end, even when I was wearing her skin and speaking with her voice, she was still in there somewhere, still trying to warn you, still trying to keep you safe." The sadness vanished, replaced by something cold and vast. "But she's quiet now. She's learned to watch from the inside while I play with her body. Would you like to see what I've taught her?" In the dream, Ethan found his voice. "Let her go. I can't let go of something that's part of me now." The claws began to move, tracing patterns in his skin that matched the symbols carved throughout their house. "But I can show you what she sees. I can give you her perspective." The bedroom around them began to change, walls stretching and twisting into impossible angles. The familiar space became a labyrinth of mirrors and shadows, and in every reflection, Ethan could see himself lying helpless, while the thing that had been his wife prepared to tear him apart. "She's watching right now," it whispered, leaning close enough that he could smell the copper scent of blood on its breath. "She can see everything I'm about to do to you, and she can't stop any of it. Isn't that beautiful?" The claws pressed deeper, and Ethan felt his strength ebbing away with his blood. "The only rule that matters," the thing said, its voice growing distant as darkness closed in around him, "is this: if you look away, I forget how to stop." Ethan woke with a gasp, his hand flying to his throat. For a moment, he expected to find blood, wounds, proof that the dream had been real. Instead, he found only sweat and the rapid pulse of his terrified heart. But as he sat up in the motel room's cheap bed, he realized something was wrong. He hadn't fallen asleep in the bed. He'd been sitting in the chair, determined to stay awake and alert. The furniture he'd pushed against the door had been moved back to its original positions. And on the nightstand, beside the bed, placed where he couldn't miss it, was a single photograph. It showed him sleeping in this very bed, in this very room, taken from the foot of the bed with perfect clarity. In the background, barely visible in the shadows near the window, was a familiar silhouette. But what made his blood freeze was a tattoo on the photo. It had been taken less than an hour ago. Ethan's hands shook as he grabbed his clothes and belongings, throwing everything into his bag with desperate haste. As he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed with a text message from Lena's number. "Did you sleep well, darling? You look so peaceful when you're dreaming. But you blinked in your sleep. You blinked, and I stepped through." Another message arrived before he could process the first. "The game has changed now. I don't need to wait for you to look away anymore. I can make you look away. I can make you blink." And then a third message that made his knees weak. "I'm behind you." Ethan spun around, expecting to see that horrible parody of his wife standing in the shadows of the motel room. But there was nothing there, just his own reflection in the dark window, wide-eyed and terrified. He grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, bursting out into the pre-dawn darkness of the motel parking lot. His car was where he'd left it, but something was different. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and on the windshield, written in what looked like condensation but couldn't be, were two words: "You be linked." Ethan ran to his car and drove away from the motel without looking back, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. In the rearview mirror, he could see the motel receding into darkness, but he thought, just for a moment, he saw a figure standing in the window of the room he'd just fled. A figure that raised one hand in a mocking wave goodbye as he drove through the empty streets. His phone buzzed with one final message. "See you soon, darling. I know where you're going." Ethan looked down at the phone for just a second, just long enough to read the message. When he looked back at the road, she was standing in his headlights. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop mere inches from the figure in the white nightgown. For a moment, they stared at each other through the windshield, Ethan terrified and breathless, and the thing wearing Lena's face smiling with terrible patience. Then she placed both hands on the hood of his car and leaned forward until her face was pressed against the glass. "Hello, darling," she said, her voice somehow audible despite the barrier between them. "I told you I was coming." Ethan fumbled for the gear shift, desperate to reverse, to flee, to put distance between himself and this nightmare. But as his hand moved toward the controls, the thing straightened up and shook its head with mock disappointment. Now, it said. "No running. We have so much to discuss." And as Ethan watched in horror, it began to sink its fingers into the metal of his car's hood, the steel yielding like clay beneath its touch. "Starting with what happens when you blink," it whispered. Despite every instinct screaming at him not to, despite knowing it was exactly what the creature wanted, Ethan's terrified eyes snapped shut for just an instant. When he opened them, the street was empty. The car's hood was unmarked, and from the passenger seat beside him came the sound of familiar laughter. "Too late," Lena's voice whispered from the darkness beside him. This time, when Ethan turned to look, there was no one there. But the scent of blood and vanilla lingered in the air, and he knew with absolute certainty that looking away had just cost him the last protection he'd had. The game, it seemed, was finally over, and he had lost.